Niall. And then in February, we're going to have Bill Fennell. He's a missionary who's ready to translate or going into translation work. He used to be at Mount Vernon Baptist Temple, and he'll be with us in February. And then Steve Click is going to be with us in March. I don't know exact dates on this. And he's going to be thanking us for his years of support. We want to be sure and be here a part of all of that and what's going on. As we were thinking about no one ever cared for me like Jesus, and I was thinking about Ann Baker. That's the song that she had at her funeral, and that was one of the songs that she requested, and I was able to look at the history of that song. Some of these songs have some great history about them, and I was thinking about, folks that we've lost this year. Of course, Johanna passed away this year also, and Ann, and then, of course, Dean's mother passed away, and I was thinking there was a couple other folks in our church, but I do know those ones particularly have passed this year. And, folks leave some fairly large holes in the church, don't they, when they're not here anymore. And, they've gone on, and they're not with us, and you miss them. And you just wonder, who's going to come to fill their place, because the folks that we're thinking about, all of them were very faithful. And Roger was another one, very faithful to be here and to be involved. And I shouldn't even say this, but I was thinking about him cleaning the floors over here this summer, doing all that over here at the school, and putting all of his time in that, and I wouldn't take anything for it. We just gave him a couple gift cards for doing that. But and he was explaining how to do it and all those things. But, that's just kind of another hole that we have, and we need to be praying that God will continue to work there. We're going to be interviewing some new members, so that's a good thing too after this service. And we have some more folks who want to join. So it's great to be able to see folks joining our church as well. I want to just take a few moments and this afternoon and think about communion and think about the Lord's Supper. This is the first of the year. That's not a revelation to anybody. But as the new year starts, do you realize this is 2020? Remember 20 years ago? Anybody remember 20 years ago? Y2K? It was going to end. I shouldn't say this, but I hear there's people still looking for the beans they buried in the backyard 20 years ago. There was general panic. And you can't realize it unless you were a part of it. It was just extraordinary how people were thinking about how, because computers couldn't figure out how to jump. Wasn't that what it was? I think that's what it was. They couldn't figure out how to jump between 1999 and 2000. That's 20 years ago. And so you think about those things. And then I heard today, all these scare things. Do not put down 20 on your check. Of course, most people don't even write checks. I still write checks, of course. Don't put down 20 on your checks because people can manipulate it somehow. I thought to myself, who comes up with some of these things? Anybody else ever? I'm going to write the date out anyway. I don't want what to happen, but I had to read the article the second time to try to figure out what they were talking about. It seems to me like if people want to rip you off, they can do it pretty easy anymore, can't they? It seems like the best way they can do it is stealing your identity online. So doesn't this date me? If you use cash, they probably can't do that. Doesn't that sound weird? But it's a fact, isn't it? They're not able to do those kind of things if that happens. Now, I know that's Neanderthalic, whatever word you want to use. But we do develop ourselves with some new problems whenever we have all these new things going on around us. But that has absolutely nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about today, because this is talking about the Lord's Supper. This is the institution in Matthew chapter 26 of the Lord's Supper. And usually we look at something to do with the blood or the broken body or maybe the 1 Corinthians passage itself. But I want us today to just spend our time right here in the Gospel of Matthew looking at just two things about this passage. And then I want to sort of go down through so we can get a grasp, hopefully, on how important this is for us as believers. Just two things. First of all, the time of the institution or the service, and secondly, the service itself. And the time of the institution, just one line in verse 26, but Jesus Christ instituting this takes up the rest of the passage down through verse 29, and verse 30, of course, is sort of a picture or capsule of what they did at the end. But the first thing I want you to notice is the timing. Look at the timing of this in verse 26, just the first line. And as they were eating. I want to think about that for a few minutes. As they were eating, in verse 26 of Matthew 26. Everybody was eating. This is the end of the Passover meal. Passover. I know you know what that's all about, but it is the most important day on the Old Testament calendar. Old Testament is all about the Passover. The time whenever the death angel passed over. That's what it means, right? Passed over. The blood was on the lintels and the doorpost. If you didn't have it there, firstborn died. Everybody else, safe. That'd be a good song title, wouldn't it? Safe in the blood of Christ. You know, you were safe because of the blood that was on that Passover. And they would remember this. You ever read, I'm sure you have, in the Deuteronomy passage where the oldest son is supposed to ask certain questions. And as he asks these questions, then the father, he responds by giving the details. And they do this every year. You know, this is a part of who they are. It's a part of the remembering of the fact that they left Egypt and they came out into the promised land, the Red Sea experience, and all the things. And really, Israel became a nation at that point. Maybe you never thought about that, but you know, they go into Egypt, 70 people. That's what Acts tells us. Jacob and his sons and their families. Before that, it was Abraham. They really weren't a nation. They were just a promise. They go into Egypt. They're there for, according to Acts, 450 years, I think it is, or 400 years. And in 400 years, they develop into a nation. Now they are a nation. And after the Red Sea and after the Passover, there was no turning back. They were God's people, and they were going to serve Him. And so this was a defining time in the Old Testament. And they were to remember this over and over again. It's not a mistake that Jesus Christ's crucifixion took place during Passover. It was fulfilling everything Passover stood for. Jesus Christ's death was fulfilling everything the Old Testament stood for. And He is now, or He was going to be for them, but for us, He is now our Passover lamb, our sacrifice. It'd be interesting to know, and I don't think anybody ever would figure out how many animals gave their lives before Jesus Christ died at Calvary. It must have been multitudes of millions and billions of animals that died with their blood being sacrificed during this time and throughout the year. And so the great contrast there is Jesus Christ doing it once for all, much better than all that Old Testament time together. So the time is during this Passover meal, and if you wanted to look it over, there were certain dishes they would have, and they would be instituted in a certain place during this meal. And so that's the background, okay? That's the timing of this. Now let's look at the institution itself. Now let's look at some, I guess, verbs, I would call them, especially in verse 26. Look at all the things He does in verse 26. He took bread, He blessed it. Okay, all these are action words. He blessed it, He brake it, He gave it to the disciples. There's at least 4 things that He does in this verse that we find here. This starts with the Lord Himself. He becomes the center. He becomes the institutor, or the one who's instituting this Passover, this last meal. So He takes the bread, He takes it, He makes it or picks it up, I would guess, and then He's going to do a couple things with it. And this is going to represent His body. Now, it is represented by the bread in this section. John chapter 6 is a marvelous chapter. I'm going to turn you back there. But in John chapter 6, we have something called the Bread of Life Discourse. It's a long chapter. almost 70, I think it's 72 verses. It starts with Jesus Christ feeding the 5,000. And then he goes in the miracle where he crosses the sea and calms the sea. And then he starts talking about being the bread of life. And during that time, he illustrates this by Moses and the man in the wilderness. And he finally gets down to this point where these people are asking him some questions. And he says, you have to eat my flesh and you have to drink my blood. Now, he's not being cannibalistic, but he is saying you have to participate with me. At that point, very point, he says this, and he says he is the bread of life. It says that people turn away and don't follow him anymore. A lot of folks leave the group. And my favorite part of the chapter is when he then looks at his disciples. And after this large group has left him, he looks at his disciples and he says, will you leave me also? And remember the classic statement of Peter. I mean, to me, this is just one of those high points, one of those Himalayan peaks of the Scriptures where Peter says, well, who would we go to? You have the words of life. Where am I going to turn? Isn't that a beautiful response? Where else could you go to find any kind of peace and contentment? So that's the background of this, this idea of him eating his flesh and drinking his blood. Here he says, he's going to, it says in verse 26, he took the bread. So this bread was a part of the whole symbolism of what was going on during that time. And I'm sure that he does this sort of, and I've seen the pictures like you have with all the people around the table. I don't know how it happened that way. That looks like a pretty extravagant room to me. I got a feeling this was just some little dinky little place in the wall, don't you, that he's having this Passover meal. That would be my understanding of this thing. But anyway, he picks it up, and so he holds it up for everybody to see. Everybody could have their focus and their attention on this bread. And that's what we're going to do here in just a second. We're going to have a wafer, and that's going to symbolize that same bread. After he does that, he blesses it. That's the second verb we find here. He sets it apart from all other bread. When you bless something, that's what you do, don't you? You set it apart. You make it special. And so this is a time of thanksgiving. He is thanking God for what's about to happen. And so this bread is going to be a special part of all that's going on. So after he took it, after he blessed it, it says he brake it. Now, I've been to communion services. Now, we don't do it here, where you have anybody else ever been to one where you have maybe a loaf or a big cracker? I don't know, you've probably been to those kind of, and that's, I have no problem with that. I do have a little problem drinking out of that same cup, though. I've been to a couple of those, too. Not in this church, but everybody drinks out of that same cup. I don't know about that deal. But, they have this one loaf, and you break a piece off, and another person breaks it off. The pastor usually does it first in the middle, and then each one takes part of it. So they're trying to follow the symbolism here of what's going on. But he says he break it. Now, the breaking it has a very important purpose, doesn't it? It's his body being broken for us. He was bruised for our iniquities. The cross was not a picnic. It wasn't a fun time. It was painful. Physically, emotionally, especially spiritually. The Father turns his back on him. But breaking his body is not something that was just a walk in the park. It was painful. And so the idea is breaking himself for us. As the Father breaks bread for his children, he is being broken for the sins of the world. And so he takes it, he blesses it, he breaks it, and then fourthly it says he gave it to his disciples. Only the ones who are followers. Remember, verses before this, Judas is gone. He left. Go do what you're going to do, Judas. He handed him the sup, and he said, Judas, whatever you're going to do, you go do it. So Judas is gone. This is for God's children. This is for God's family. It's not for the world. It's not for unsaved folks. This is for those who know Christ as personal Savior. We're a family. There should be nothing that unifies a church any more than communion. There should be nothing that binds God's people together any closer than sitting around the table, having these elements together, because we are physically demonstrating that we are His children. And He's given this to us to understand that and to understand what goes on there. You know, it should also draw us together because in the other part, in 1 Corinthians, we are to confess. We are to examine our lives. We are to be sure that we are right with Him. We are to present ourselves, every one of us today, presenting ourselves to Him as a pure bride, doing her very best. That should be our presentation before the Father today because of what He's done. And so it says, He gave it to the disciples, and they had the right to take it because of what's going to happen and because of what they were going to believe. And then notice what He says. He says, take, eat, this is my body. Take, eat. What should they do with this? They had to participate with it. They had to partake of it. You know, food, until it's eaten, doesn't do you any good. We just had a meal. Wouldn't it have been amazing if all of us would have gone over there with that food on the table and we would have pulled our chairs up and we would have all just sat there and looked at it? Wouldn't that have been stupid? It would not have done any. It may have done your nostrils some good as you smelled it, but it wouldn't do you one bit of good. Food doesn't do any of us any good until you participate, until you take it. That's why all these cookbooks have all these beautiful pictures. And that's great. But until it is made and you participate, you really do not appreciate what's there. And the same thing is true when it comes to His broken body. We must participate. We don't just look, just observe, just become familiar with. You and I have to, let's put it in our language that we understand, we have to accept. We have to appropriate it into our own lives. We have to make it a part of us. And so we participate with this. And what does it show? His body. It represents the body of Jesus Christ. And what's the body? The incarnation, the coming from heaven to earth in that human form. Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. Coming to this earth in its human form, leaving all the glories of heaven, taking on flesh like we have. What a step downward that was for Him to do. And that's what we've been celebrating Christmas time, okay? The incarnation. So it was His body. So that's the first part. Verse 27, second part, it says, and He took the cup. And so there are two elements that are involved here. First of all, it says that He took the bread, verse 26. Same language in verse 27. He took the cup. Okay, so Jesus took the bread, and the He here would be Jesus again. He took the cup. And notice the second time it says He blessed it in verse 26, but now it says He gave thanks. I think it's a similar understanding of what's going on. Okay, He is showing that this is part of the ordination also that He is about to institute. So He takes the cup, or He took the cup, and He gave thanks, and He gave it to them. So in both times, before He breaks it, of course, because it's bread, but now He takes it, He gives thanks, and He gives it. Okay? There has to be this activity of Him giving it for us. Giving thanks shows us this is part of the ordinance that He's doing. And we must have our eyes on God all the time. He thanks Him for both. And He starts in verse 27. Drink ye all of it. Drink you all of it. It's a command. It's a definite command. You are a welcome guest around the table. You have been incorporated. You disciples are into my body. Judas is gone. Son of perdition. Out of the picture. But the rest of you, as you sat here around this table together, you are part of the family. You must have your eyes on Jesus Christ, and you are a welcome guest. Isn't it great to be a welcome guest at the table of God today? Think about that. You are a welcome guest to sit at His table and to participate with Him. And then He gives us explanation. After He tells them to drink it, He explains to them what this is all about. Verse 28. For this is my blood of the New Testament. The blood of Christ, He says it is His blood before animals. after animal, after animal, after animal. Now this is my blood. This is the New Testament, the New Covenant. If you want to do a study, really a great study, look at Hebrews about the New Covenant, the New Testament. Go back to Jeremiah and Ezekiel. They talk about the same thing, how that in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 talks about this new covenant that we're in. 1 Corinthians, especially chapter 3, deals with this, how that in the Old Testament he wrote on tablets of stone his law. But in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, now he writes it on the fleshly tablets of our hearts. What's he talking about? The Holy Spirit working in your life. Bring it inside of us, making it intrinsic to who we are. And so he said, this is the New Testament, the New Covenant. It's not the old, this is new, this is something I am instituting. All the benefits, all the privileges of the New Covenant are yours because of the death of Christ. So it is the New Covenant, and notice it is shed. It had to be spilt. It had to be given. It had to be taken from His body. It had to leave. And the sign here, of course, is His death. He had to die for this to take place in our lives. But I like the next part. It is shed for many. Many. Not just a few select groups. Anybody in the world who listens to the message can have salvation. He shed it for many people. And notice the last part, it's for the remission of sins. Our sins have been forgiven. Our purchase has been complete. We are now reconciled back to our Father because of the fact that He has provided for us remission of sins. And so He explains this to His disciples. And the last verse, verse 29, sort of gives us a summary statement of what's going to happen. But I say unto you, sort of a promise. It ends with a promise. I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. So this is a sign of the fact that one day we're going to participate with Him again. It's a future sign of what's going to happen. There's going to be a time in His Father's kingdom, heaven, I guess we could call it that, where we are going to have this fellowship time with Him again. Now, I can't even imagine what that's going to be like. I don't think any of us can. Maybe it's the marriage supper of the Lamb described for us. Time whenever we sit down and we participate in this fellowship with Him one more time. And when they sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Expression of joy. Anytime you sing a hymn, it's because you have joy in your heart. It's over. His part is complete. Now, in the rest of the chapter, He's going to go, and this is the time whenever He asks them to watch. They don't watch, they're sleeping. He comes and they arrest Him. So all that's right on the heels of this. This is just the time right before that occurs. They go to the Mount of Olives, and they have a time of prayer and meditation. Remember what He's asked them to do? Watch and pray. Pray for me. It's going to be a terrible time I'm going through. I need your encouragement. Well, he's praying about the cup. Verse 42 would be an example of that. Verse 39, a couple times he asked that. He says, if this is possible for this cup. He's coming to grips with the fact, as far as my understanding, he's coming to grips with the fact of all the sins of mankind placed upon His holy life, because He never sinned any time in His life. And now all this is going to be placed upon Him. So He says, it's going to come. And Father, is there any other way? I see His humanity coming through here at this point. Time of meditation after this with the Lord's Supper. And so this is the actual, and 3 of the Gospels record this. This is the actual time whenever Jesus Christ sits down and says to them that they are going to participate with Him together. And so, next few moments, I have our deacons come, prepare our table for us. We are going to participate